As we shift our focus over to the grain markets now, we were joined this week by Jeff Peterson of Heartland Farm Partners. The markets did not trade on Monday because of President's Day, but when they opened on Tuesday, a number of factors helped drive the prices higher to start the week. Much of the concern is centered around Ukraine, and that's where we begin the discussion with Jeff. Our grain analyst this week is Jeff Peterson, the president of Heartland Farm Partners. Jeff, thanks for being here today.
You bet. It's always nice to talk to you, Bryce.
Jeff, we're having today's conversation on Thursday. I think it's important that I note that because the situation with Ukraine and Russia is changing by the minute. So I want our viewers to be aware of that fact. As we jump into today's conversation, as we look at that Ukraine-Russia situation, is it the wheat market that stands to rally the most because of this news?
Yeah, it sure seems like what it is showing so far is that the wheat has been strong. It's actually traded strong overnight, traded up limit across the Chicago, the Kansas City, and Minneapolis exchanges, and we also are trading very strongly during the day session today. Overnight, though, actually the biggest move would have been on soybeans, but that market was not able to hold those, and it's since backed off some from where it would have been in overnight trade. So overall, I'd say wheat is holding up really strong right now.
So we talk about the wheat, you mentioned the soybeans as well. What about corn? What's corn do here?
Yeah, corn's falling along very well, and if you think about it, Ukraine's a big supplier of corn. They make up about 16% of the world's exports. So as you wrestle with that number, there's about 1.3 billion bushels that USDA was counting on exports out of Ukraine. Now, a portion of those have already been shipped, of course, but there's still some of those that have not, and so that's what the market has to wrestle with. So I do still think we see soybeans and corn both follow along with wheat, and at each times might take a leadership role, but I do think we see strength across all three yet.
Something coming out of Ukraine right before we came on this broadcast was the fact that the ports are being shut down. What are the implications? Remind us how important Ukraine is to the global grain supply.
They are very important. If you think about it, it's over 100 million acres of crop ground. And if you just kind of think about the U.S. situation between corn and beans, we've got about 180 million acres, so that gives you kind of a reference point. But as you dig into the deeper what USDA is counting on out of Ukraine for exports, they make up 20% of the rapeseed exports. They make up 9% of the sunflower. Over on the barley side, and think about barley, that can be feed or that can be malt. They make up about 18% of the world exports on that. And I'd mentioned the corn side. And then you get down to wheat, and it makes up about 10% or 12%, of the wheat exports. But when you put a number on that, that's about 880 million bushels. And then the other thing you have to do, though, is that on the wheat side, also include with what's going on with Russia. And between Russia and Ukraine, that's about 29% of the world wheat exports. So I think that's why the market's been given a little more strength over to the wheat side than the other markets so far.
Now, Jeff, as we look at the situation, obviously a lot of folks are focusing on the short-term implications of this, but if we look out even further to the long term, what could that look like? Yeah,
so as we dig in, we'll start first on the export side. We are familiar with how the Ukrainian government and what their export policy was. If the Russians do go ahead and put a new government in place in Ukraine, we don't necessarily know what their policy will be. So we're not quite sure how that will work in regard to the amount that they'll be exporting out. In addition, we have to think about the time of year, and we're not that terribly away from spring planting. So depending on how long this lasts, this attack into Ukraine depends on what's going to happen to acres, what could happen to yields. Will they be able to get all the inputs that they need to successfully plant that crop? So that becomes a longer, bigger concern that we have.
Mm-hmm. And back here in the United States, that kind of plays right into the conversation as we're gearing up for corn versus soybeans. What's going to happen with planting acres in the U.S., though, right?
Yeah, that's almost definitely. We saw a little look at that out of the USDA Ag Outlook. They did lower the corn planted acres from last year to this year, 1.4 million acres. They did increase soybeans, 800,000 acres. As a result, though, it's interesting, did bring down the ending stocks on soybeans, but did raise it on corn. Now, I think we'll see a lot of changes coming as we go down the road on the demand side for both of those. But a couple of the key things that we're looking to take out of those report, not so much the acres, because we know there'll be better acres out of basically the planning intentions report at the end of March, but we'll take a look at those yields. That 181 yield is a trend line on corn, and a 51.5 yield on the soybeans. Those are yields that we'll hold on to and use down the road.
Let me wrap up with this question. Is there any top to the market when we talk about war, Jeff?
Well, right now, I think that's what's happening. We're getting a lot of premium. Overnight, there was a lot of traders that were short traders, had sold the market short, getting out of the market. I wouldn't say there's been any precedent that would say that just because this happened, that necessarily put in a top. I think the events and how things unfold going forward will determine whether or not we saw a top overnight or we need to see another leg higher down the road.
Jeff, a lot of developments here. Thank you for coming on Market Drill to give your take.
You betcha. I always appreciate it. I like talking about the markets with you, Bryce.